He thought the uniform would embarrass him. He thought I'd fold the moment he looked at me that way. The way he always did, like I was a problem he'd never quite figured out how to solve. He was wrong. I've been a Canadian Armed Forces officer for 11 years. I've served 2 tours overseas, spent 14 months in Latvia as part of NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence, and last spring I was promoted to lieutenant commander. My commanding officer called it one of the fastest rises she'd seen in a decade. My mother called it, "That whole military thing you're still doing. That tells you everything you need to know about my family." My sister Renee is 3 years younger than me, and has always been the one my parents pointed to when they wanted to feel proud. She's beautiful in the way that makes rooms go quiet. She studied interior design at Ryerson, and she married into exactly the kind of life my parents had always imagined for themselves: old money, a house in Rosedale, a husband whose family had been in Toronto real estate for 4 generations. His name is Spencer, and he is genuinely a decent person. I want to be clear about that. Spencer never did anything wrong. This story isn't about him. It's about the dinner the night before his wedding and what happened the morning after. My parents live in Oakville, the kind of neighborhood where every house has a double garage and a Ring doorbell, and a sign in the front window that says "Blessed." My father spent 30 years in commercial insurance and retired at 62. My mother volunteers at the hospital gift shop on Tuesdays, and plays pickleball on Thursdays, and has for as long as I can remember, organized her sense of self-worth around what the neighbors think of her. I am not what the neighbors think is impressive. My sister is. I flew in from CFB Esquimalt on a Thursday afternoon. My flight landed at Pearson at 2, and I took the UP Express into Union and then a cab to the hotel where the wedding party was staying, a Marriott near the waterfront that smelled like eucalyptus and money. I had my dress uniform in a garment bag over my shoulder, and a duffel with everything else. I hadn't been home in 8 months. The last time I'd spoken to my mother was a 20-minute call at Christmas, where she spent 12 of those minutes telling me about Renee's engagement photos. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant in Yorkville, one of those places with no menu prices and servers who refill your water without being asked. Spencer's parents had booked the private dining room, and when I arrived, his father, a tall man named Douglas with the kind of handshake that meant something, stood up and introduced himself like he was genuinely glad I was there. My own father did not stand up. He was at the far end of the table with my mother, and when I walked in, he looked at me the way you look at a text message that arrives at an inconvenient time. A flicker, an assessment, then back to his conversation. I sat near Spencer's aunt, a woman named Harriet, who had done 2 years with CUSO in Ghana in the 80s, and wanted to talk about logistics and infrastructure and what the food was actually like. She was the best conversation I had all night. At some point, my mother leaned across the table and said, quietly but not quietly enough, "You're not planning to wear the uniform to the ceremony, are you?" I looked at her. "Yes, I am." She pressed her lips together. "Your father thinks it might make things feel a bit military. I am in the military, you know what I mean." I did know what she meant. She meant Spencer's family was wealthy and connected, and the wedding was going to be photographed for a lifestyle blog that Renee followed, and a woman in combat ribbons and epaulettes was not the aesthetic she had imagined for the background of her daughter's perfect day. I didn't say any of that. I just said, "I'll be wearing my uniform," and turned back to Harriet, who was explaining the supply chain for fresh vegetables in Accra. My father didn't speak to me once that entire evening, not once. When we were leaving, he shook Spencer's father's hand for a long time, laughing at something, and walked past me like I was a coat rack. In the cab back to the hotel, I sat with my hands in my lap and looked out at the lake. I told myself I'd been through harder things, which was true, but it didn't make my chest feel any less like someone had parked something heavy on it. The wedding ceremony was at a venue in the Distillery District, an old brick building that had been renovated into an event space, all exposed beams and Edison bulbs, and an outdoor courtyard where the actual vows would take place. September in Toronto, and the weather had cooperated in that grudging way September sometimes does. Cool in the morning, warm by noon, sky the color of a swimming pool. I arrived early. I always arrive early. The venue staff directed family to a staging area near the side entrance, and I was standing there, garment bag over my arm, when my father appeared. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a tie that matched Renee's color scheme. He looked good. He always looked good. My father is the kind of man who presents beautifully. He saw me in my uniform and stopped, not for long, just a beat. Then he walked over and said, in a low, steady voice that he had clearly been rehearsing, "I need you to go back to your room and change. No, this is your sister's wedding. I know that, then act like it." He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. This is not the place for a costume. I felt something go very still inside me. The word costume. I had been wearing this uniform the day a colleague was airlifted out of a field exercise with a ruptured spleen, and I had held it together long enough to coordinate the evacuation, and then sat on the ground afterward and shook for 20 minutes. I had been wearing this uniform when I received a commendation from the Chief of Defense Staff. I had been wearing this uniform on a February morning in Riga, when the temperature was -26 and the wind made it feel like -40, and I was the senior officer on the ground, and 37 people were counting on me to keep them focused and operational. My father called it a costume. "I'm wearing my uniform," I said. "I've been wearing it for 11 years and I'm not stopping today." He looked at me the way he used to look at my report cards when I was 16, and he felt I hadn't tried hard enough. That particular combination of disappointment and contempt that he'd perfected over decades of practice. "Fine," he said. "Then you sit in the back, behind the family section. You don't want to draw attention to yourself. You shouldn't have dressed like this." He walked away before I could respond. I stood there for a moment. I could hear the string quartet warming up in the courtyard. I could smell the flowers from the arrangements someone was carrying past me in enormous white buckets. I thought about calling a cab. I thought about my room at the Marriott and the minibar, and the terrible TV selection, and how I could order pad thai to the room and be asleep by 9. I thought about Renee, who had called me 3 weeks ago and said, "I know things are weird with Mom and Dad, but please come. I want you there," and she'd meant it. I could hear it in her voice. Whatever else was complicated, that much was real, so I stayed. The ceremony began at 2 o'clock. I found a seat near the back of the courtyard, 3 rows behind where the family was arranged, next to a couple I didn't recognize who turned out to be friends of Spencer's from his undergrad days at Queen's. They were pleasant. They offered me a program. We talked in low voices about the drive in from Kingston. The vows were beautiful. Spencer cried. Renee laughed at him crying and then cried herself, and the officiant, a woman with silver hair and an unhurried delivery, gave them the kind of ceremony that actually means something. I watched my sister become a wife and felt a complicated bloom of emotion that I didn't try to name. Then the ceremony ended and the guests moved toward the courtyard exits, and my father found me. He didn't lower his voice this time. We were in the narrow corridor between the ceremony space and the reception hall, and people were still filing past, and my father stood in front of me and said, loudly enough that the couple from Queens definitely heard, "You spent the whole ceremony drawing attention to yourself. You couldn't even do this one thing for your sister." I sat in the back, in that. He gestured at my uniform. "People were looking. People look at a lot of things. Don't be smart with me. This family has given you every opportunity you ever had, and you come here and make it about yourself, and then you wonder why we don't." He stopped, collected himself. "You could have been something. You chose this instead. I want you to understand how long it took me to find the right response. I'm not someone who yells. I learned a long time ago that yelling is expensive and rarely productive." I breathed in, I breathed out, and then very calmly I said, "I am something, Dad. I've been something for a long time. You just haven't been paying attention." He opened his mouth to respond. That's when the doors at the far end of the corridor opened. They didn't burst open. That's not how military personnel move. They opened steadily with deliberateness, the way you open a door when you know exactly where you're going. And the man who came through first was Rear Admiral Kenneth Ford, my commanding officer's commanding officer, a man who had served for 34 years and whose presence in any room recalibrated it the way a tuning fork recalibrates a piano. Behind him came others. Not 300, I want to be accurate. There were 41 of them. I know because I counted later when I was trying to process what had happened. 41 Canadian Armed Forces personnel in full dress uniforms, Navy, Army, Air Force, who had driven or flown to Toronto that weekend because Admiral Ford had sent a message to a group chat 3 days earlier that said, and I am quoting directly, "One of our people is being asked to be ashamed of her uniform at her sister's wedding. I'm going." Who else? I didn't know. I want to be absolutely clear that I had no idea. Nobody told me. It was not coordinated with me in any way. The first I knew of it was when Admiral Ford walked down that corridor in his dress whites and stopped in front of me, and the sound of 41 pairs of boots coming to attention behind him was something I will hear in my memory for the rest of my life. He saluted me first. A rear admiral saluting a lieutenant commander is not the normal direction of things. I know that. He knows that. He did it anyway, and I recovered fast enough to return it, because 11 years of training means your body knows what to do even when your brain is still 3 seconds behind. Then he turned to my father. He didn't raise his voice. Admiral Ford has a voice that carries without effort, the kind of voice that has given orders in bad weather on open water, and been heard clearly by everyone present. He said, "Your daughter has served this country in conditions most people will never encounter, with a level of discipline and courage that most people will never be required to demonstrate. This uniform is not a costume, it is a record of what she has done and who she is. And I think you should know that." My father said nothing. The guests who had been filing past had stopped filing. They were just standing there, somewhere between confused and riveted. The way people look when they realize they are watching something that is going to matter. Admiral Ford reached into his jacket and produced a small flat case. He opened it and showed me what was inside and said, "This was meant to be presented at the base in October, but it seemed like today was the right time. It was a meritorious service medal for the coordinated evacuation operation I'd run 18 months earlier during the training incident in Alberta. The one where the weather closed in faster than predicted, and I'd managed to get everyone out safe, including 2 civilians who'd gotten turned around on a back road. I'd filed the after-action report and handed it up the chain, and more or less stopped thinking about it, because that's how you function. You do the thing, you write the report, you move on. I didn't move on fast enough to stop myself from crying, which I am not proud of but which I also cannot pretend didn't happen. 41 people in dress uniforms stood there while a rear admiral pinned a medal to my chest at my sister's wedding reception. Spencer's father had materialized somewhere to my left and was completely silent. Spencer himself was standing behind my mother, and I saw his hand find her shoulder, not in comfort exactly but in the way you steady someone who looks like they might need steadying. My mother was crying, not because she was proud, at least, not only because she was proud. I think she was crying because she was realizing, in real time, in front of all of these people, the distance between the story she had told herself about me and the reality that was standing in front of her. My father had not moved. He was still standing exactly where he'd been when the doors opened. And his face had gone through several things: surprise, something close to anger, and then something I hadn't seen from him in a long time. Something that looked, if I'm being generous, like recognition. Admiral Ford turned back to my father one more time. He didn't lecture him, he just said, "She had the right instincts from the beginning." Then he shook my hand and he left, and all 41 of them filed out behind him, in the same deliberate, unhurried way they'd come in, and the corridor was quiet. The reception happened. There was dinner, rack of lamb with a maple glaze, very Ontario, genuinely delicious, and dancing and speeches and all the things that happen at weddings. Spencer's best man told a story about a canoe trip that went wrong somewhere in Algonquin Park. Renee laughed until she had to fix her makeup. My father sat 2 tables away from me for the entire evening and did not come over. My mother did. She found me near the end of the night, when the dancing had started and the lights had gone low and it was easy to exist in corners without being noticed. She sat down next to me without asking if I wanted company, which is a very mother thing to do. She looked tired, she looked old a little, in a way she hadn't looked at the beginning of the day. She said, "I didn't know about the medal. Nobody did. That was the point." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't always know how to be proud of you," she said finally. "It doesn't mean I'm not. I thought about that for a while. It's not an apology. I know that. It's not a reckoning or a turning point or the beginning of the kind of relationship we should have had for 30 years. It's just a sentence a tired woman said to her daughter at the end of a long day. But I've handled situations with less to work with than that." I put my hand over hers on the table. She turned her palm up and held on. The cab back to the hotel took 15 minutes. I sat with my medal in its open case on my knee and watched the city go by. The lights on the lake, the CN Tower doing its slow seasonal color change, the particular quiet of Toronto on a Saturday night when the bars haven't quite let out yet. I didn't feel triumphant, I want to say that. I've seen people describe moments like this in terms of victory, and I understand the impulse, but it wasn't like that. It was more like the feeling after a long operation when you've done everything correctly, and the outcome is what you hoped. A kind of exhausted clarity. A sense that things are where they belong, even if where they belong is complicated. My father texted me the next morning. It was 4 sentences. He said he hadn't known about the commendation. He said he was sorry he hadn't paid closer attention. He said he used the word about the uniform, and he knew it. He said he hoped we could talk when I was back in town. 4 sentences. 11 years. I'm not naive enough to think 4 sentences fixes anything. But I'm not dismissive enough to pretend they don't mean anything either. You take what people can give, and you figure out from there what you can build. I fly back to Esquimalt on Tuesday. I have a briefing on Wednesday morning and a training evaluation on Thursday that I've been preparing for since July. My life is full and demanding and, most days, deeply satisfying in ways I don't have enough words for. But I keep thinking about that corridor. The sound of 41 pairs of boots. The look on my father's face when a rear admiral told him that his daughter had the right instincts from the beginning. He wasn't wrong. I did. I just had to wait long enough for the right people to say it out loud.